with a J. Who is it? Jehu. That's right. And then in 11, we have what happens? Chapter 11. Wipe out all of the who? All of the people all of the house of, the rulers in what? Okay, Judah. And she does, except there is a woman who hides baby, who? All right, and hides him in what part? Where, rather? Hides him in the what? In the temple. And then there is a priest who befriends him, and Joash, and his name is Jehoiada, and he turns out okay for a while. And Joash is just a child really when he begins to reign, and it's obvious that Jehoiada was actually the power behind the throne for a while. But he was 7 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned how many years? Verse 1 of chapter 12, I'm sorry. That's right. So Joash is king for a while, and it's through him. It's this one of the tremendous displays of God's providence in the sparing of Joash and his being able to become king. In 13, we have the reigns of Jehoahaz in Israel and Jehoash in Israel, also known as Joash. So you got two names: Joash in the southern kingdom, Joash in the northern, and their reigns are not too many years apart, actually. And then chapter 14, the reigns of Amaziah in Judah, and then Jeroboam II in Israel. And during the days of Jeroboam II, how were things politically, geographically, economically? Good or bad? They exactly. They did extremely well. However, spiritually, this was during the times of Isaiah, Hosea. Spiritually, they were what? They were bankrupt. And so that gives people a false sense of being of well-being. You know, everything's going right, family-wise, economically, commercially, politically, geographically. They extended the boundaries, but spiritually, they were bankrupt. 2 Kings 15, we have the reigns of Uzziah, also known as Azariah, and then Zechariah for 6 months. 1 month in verses 13 through 15, Shallum. And then who after Shallum? Menahem. Then Pekahiah. And then 27 through 31, Pekah. And then in chapter 16, we have the reigns of Jotham and Ahaz in Judah. And then the 17th chapter is really the end of Israel with the reign of whom? Yes, Hoshea, and primarily. We've got the others. It's interesting that they're at the very end. Some of them, you have 2 years, 10 years, but it's a few 6 months, 1 month. It's just anarchy in the northern kingdom, and so that really ends in the northern kingdom ends in chapter 17 with Hoshea, and Samaria begins to have all kinds of people replacing the Israelites who had been displaced. Somebody had a hand. Was that you, Lynn? Anybody? Okay, alrighty. Then let's see. That's it. That's it for our readings. We'll go through 17. And then we have basically Judah alone from 18 through the end. Comment or question on any of this? All right, good. We are in chapter 7 of Acts. We are on page 35 of our workbooks. But the main thing is Acts 7. Tell me, who wants to, well, let's do it together. What do we have in chapter 1? Ascension of Jesus, appointment of, all right, 2. All right, establishment of church, day of Pentecost. 3.
Lame beggar healed.
Peter and John heal the lame man, and then they speak on Solomon's porch. 4. Peter
and John before the council.
That's right. Peter and John are in prison, brought before the council, and then they are charged not to teach or preach in the name of Jesus. Then they go back. We have the prayer with the other apostles, and then a summary of the early church in their unity and then their benevolence. And benevolently, who is specifically mentioned as having a field and sowed it? Barnabas. In chapter 5, you have have a couple that evidently want Barnabas' notoriety. Who are they? Ananias and Sapphira. Lie and die. And then, but when that happens, there's great fear that comes upon the church, and there's great respect for the apostles, to the degree that even they're bringing sick people out, hoping that even the shadow of Peter might come over them. And who did this infuriate? The high priest. And so then they imprison all the apostles, bring them before the Sanhedrin, and they are minded to do what to them? Kill them. Who intercedes? Gamaliel. And it ends up that they don't kill them, but they what? They beat them. And so in 6, you would think, well, that would slow it down. But in these days, the number of disciples was multiplying to the degree that it led to what? The Grecian widows were being neglected in the daily services or ministration. So the apostles said, choose you out 7 men full of good report, full of the Holy Spirit and the wisdom, whom we may appoint over this business. It pleased the multitude, so they did. And without going through all the names, 2 are significant. The first 2 mentioned to the narrative. Who are they? Stephen and Philip. And then so we have Stephen debating in the synagogue of the libertines or the freedmen, and they could not resist the wisdom and the spirit by which he spoke. They accused him of 4 things. What were they? You blaspheme Moses, God, this holy place or the temple, Jerusalem, and the law. All right. So in 7, we find that Stephen is brought before the Sanhedrin, and are these things so? You men of Israel, God appeared to our father Abraham back in where? Before he dwelt in Mesopotamia. And he makes the point throughout. When he was in Mesopotamia, thank you, David. When he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran. I got that part wrong. So here we are. Let's go back real quickly. Where we are in the major division of Acts is the general history of the church, primarily in Jerusalem. However, in 8 through 12, there's going to be the spread of the gospel after the death of Stephen. But primarily Peter's work among Jews in the Jerusalem church. I was thinking just early this morning, in 8, Philip goes to the city of Samaria. Then you have the conversion of the Ethiopian. But Peter and John are mentioned. They go down to Samaria and lay hands on certain ones that they would receive miraculous powers. 9, we have the conversion of Saul of Tarsus. And then a little bit of Peter's work in Lydda and then Joppa. In 10, we have the conversion of Cornelius. 11, we have Peter's explanation, and then a brief on the church at Antioch, which is going to be the sending church for Paul on his what? On his 3 journeys. And then in chapter 12, which is kind of like the final nail in the coffin, who is actually killed in chapter 12? James, the brother of John. Somebody else is imprisoned. Peter. And so it's obvious the gospel you need to go where people would appreciate it. So in chapter 12, that happened. James, the brother John, is killed. Peter is in prison but miraculously released. Then we have the death of Herod Agrippa I at the end of the chapter. So that puts these chapters in a type of a transitional period. And after really the stoning of Stephen, Peter is mentioned, but they're going to lay their hands. They're going to lay their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul at the end of 7. And the very first verse of chapter 8 says, and Saul was consenting to this murder. He was consenting to it. And that'll come up later. So the shift begins to change to the work of Saul and then his conversion in chapter 9. Okay, so here's where we are overall. And here's where we are with Stephen's speech. He begins with the call of Abraham and ends with the crucifixion of Christ. And we just want to keep in mind we emphasized this Wednesday night, the 4 charges against Stephen that form the background to his speech: Moses, God, this holy place, which would include the temple as well as Jerusalem, and the law of Moses. And we made these points that these are, it's interesting how different speeches emphasize different aspects of the Jewish history, depending on the purpose. And Stephen, by inspiration, weaves together their speech in a type of a panoramic view, calling to name Abraham. And then he just moves from Abraham had Isaac, Jacob, and the patriarchs. And the patriarchs moved with jealousy against Joseph. It's almost like he skips all of that and just goes to Joseph and how God was with him whom they rejected. And then Israel grew as a nation away from the land of Canaan. And then the thrust of his speech, really, insofar as just volume of verses is concerned, is with Moses. And so we know the history just like they did. Well, I don't know if we know it as well as they did, but we know their history. They knew their history. And so Moses is emphasized because it was through Moses that God worked miracles. It was through Moses the law came. And that was one of the charges against Stephen. And then he mentioned, of all the history he could have mentioned, he said, now the tabernacle was in the wilderness. He mentions that particular, not Jerusalem. And it was replaced by Solomon's temple. And then he quotes from Isaiah 66, 1 and 2. He says, yet, the heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. What manner of house will you build unto me, saith the Lord of hosts? But to this man will I look, even to him that is poor and of contrite spirit, and that trembles at my word. So God is the ruler of all. He's the ruler of heaven. And the earth is like his footstool. So how are you going to contain somebody like God in a local temple? And then he says, you're just like your ancestors. You resist the Holy Spirit as your fathers did. And who among the prophets did they not persecute? And they killed him that was predicted, and showed forth the coming of the righteous one, of whom you have become betrayers and murderers, ye who received the law and kept it not. So here's how he ends. Of course, they didn't like it. But that's a general outline, and I wanted to get that flavor, just keep that flavor before our thinking. One reason I'm doing this is because when I was first getting serious about the Bible, I didn't think about it that way. I just kind of, Stephen's giving this speech, and he's just kind of going through their history, and then he ends up, I didn't put it all together. I'll just say it that way. And I feel like when you put it together and make the connections between chapter 6 and the very accusations they were making against Stephen, and then think outside the box. I wonder why he's choosing Abraham, and what point does he make about Abraham? He doesn't mention Melchizedek. Paul in Hebrews does. And he doesn't mention some of the things that Stephen does. Why? They got to have particular points of interest and a driving point from the historical record or narrative that they mention. So when you look at it from that point, it becomes, to me, it becomes extremely powerful. No wonder they couldn't resist the wisdom and spirit by which he spoke. There's no way. All right, let's read some. Let me read the first few verses that deal with Abraham, 1 through 8 here. Let's see, David, if you would, 1 through 8 of chapter 7.
Then the high priest said, "Are these things so?" And he said, "Brethren and fathers, listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, Get out of your country and from your relatives, and come to a land that I will show you." And he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, he moved him to this land in which he now dwells. And God gave him no inheritance in it, not even enough to set his foot on. But even when Abraham had no child, he promised to give it to him for a possession, and to his descendants after him. But God spoke in this way, that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land, and that they would bring them into bondage and oppress them 400 years. And the nation to whom they will be in bondage I will judge, said God, and after that they shall come out and serve me in this place. Then he gave him the covenant of circumcision, and so Abraham begot Isaac, and circumcised him on the 8th day, and Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs.
All right, so now, thank you. So he moves from Abraham, there in the end of verse 8, to Isaac, to Jacob, and then the 12 patriarchs, or the sons of Jacob. And then he moves immediately to the patriarch's disposition toward Joseph, verse 9. And really, in the next section, he deals with Joseph and how his brothers hated him. I've got some questions here on page 35. Note again that God was not limited to making himself known only in the Holy Land or around the temple. He did not appear to Abraham in Jerusalem, but where? In Mesopotamia. Now, reconcile Acts 7 to the events as they occurred recorded in Genesis 11:27 through 12:5. There looks like there seems to be a discrepancy here. In 11:27, let's keep our finger there. Turn all the way back to Genesis 11. The genealogies of Noah down to Abraham are mentioned. Let's say them while we're turning. Just say them. Noah, Shem, Salah, Peleg, Serug, Nahor, Terah, Abraham. Good. All right, so we're introduced then in verse 27. These are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, Haran. Haran begat Lot, and Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur. Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abraham's wife was Sarah, and so on. Sarah was barren, verse 30. So verse 31, Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his son's son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law. And they went forth with them from Ur to go into the land of Canaan, and they came unto Haran and dwelt there. And then Terah, Abram's father, died in Haran. Now, what we don't learn that Stephen says, but it's implied in this passage, it's just not stated, is that God actually spoke to Abraham where? In Ur. That's right. It's implied because why would he leave a city like Ur, which was a modern day city, and go into a land, and you go up in Haran, stay there for a while, and then his father dies, and then why would he do that? It looks as if we'll keep reading. In chapter 12, they're at Haran. Jehovah said, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, from your father's house, into the land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and bless thee, and make your name great. You'll be a blessing. I'll bless them that bless thee. Him that curses thee will I curse. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. That looks like he says all that at Haran. And then so Abraham gets up and leaves with Lot. And he takes Sarah, his wife, and they go down into the land of Canaan. And then they pass, verse 6, through Shechem unto the oak of Moreh. And the Canaanites in the land. And then he gives the third promise, which is in verse 7, the what? The land promise, that's right. To thy seed will I give this land. So you have the nation and the seed promise given, it looks like, in Haran, and the land in Shechem. But if you turn all the way, let's go back to Acts 7. God made these promises to Abraham, actually, Brother Gene mentioned just a moment ago, when he was still first in Ur, in Mesopotamia, before he got up to Haran. And so what we put all this together, and what happens is God promised him the promises and told him to leave in Ur. That's why he went to Haran. At Haran, he repeated them and then said, I want you to leave Haran and go into a land that I will show you. And he did. And then when he came eventually to Shechem, he gave him what promise? The land promise. So Shechem is right there in the very close to Samaria, and it's just in the very heart of the land promise. We'll see, that's where Joseph, you remember, is buried. But so that the reason I'm bringing some of this up in Acts 7, there have been some very liberal Bible critics who claim that Stephen made some mistakes here, and that he just didn't get it all right. He was just what's that? Disinformation. And that's not the case. It's not contradiction, but complementary, with an E, C-O-M-P-L-E. It adds to get the whole picture. And that's true. That's true in so many passages. We have an emphasis, and then here's an inspired writer in someplace else that says something that we didn't learn in this over here. I'm thinking in Hebrews 11, where by faith they dwelt. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. He dwelt in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for the city which hath the foundation, whose builder and maker is God. He dwelt in tents with Isaac and Jacob. Now, if you read through Genesis, you won't find that. But it's obvious if you put the ages together. Abraham was how old when Isaac was born? 100. And Isaac was how old when Jacob was born? 60. He was 40 when he married Rebekah, 60 when he had Jacob and Esau. And so you have 160. So Abraham would have been 160 when Isaac had Jacob. And Abraham died at 175. So Abraham was contemporary with Jacob for 15 years. So what that means is, when it looks like in the Genesis record, well, Abraham died before even Isaac and Rebekah had Jacob and Esau. That's what it looks like. But you put the ages together, and then you see in Hebrews, well, they were together, during that time. But you don't see that just reading the Genesis account. So I say all that to say that when we come back to Stephen, he didn't make mistakes. He just gave further information that helps us to appreciate the whole story. I mentioned in the note under number 2, Bible critics often charge Stephen with making several historical mistakes. That's the first one they claim he makes. First is implied in the above question, and we actually went through all of that. Stephen gives additional information. Number 3, while God made promise to Abraham that he would give him and his descendants the land of Canaan, did Abraham ever possess any of that land personally? No. That's right. He had to buy the field in which was the cave of Machpelah, but he didn't live there, and that was just like a burial plot, and so he actually never inherited. And mentioned in the note, while he bought a burial plot for his wife, this gave him no right to live there. The field in which the cave of Machpelah was his only possession in the promised land. All right, and there again, you think about the 11th chapter of Hebrews, he went out by faith, he became a sojourner in the land of promises, in a land not his own. And he dwelt with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for the city which has what? That's right. It has foundations whose builder and maker is God. And he goes on to say, these all could have gone back if they had desired, but they looked for a better country, that is a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he's prepared for them a city. That is just so beautiful. Those passages in the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews. But, all right, in number 4, what verse in Genesis 15 corresponds to Stephen's statement in Acts 7, verse 6? Verse 13. Now, it's an interesting thing here. They'll say this is the second mistake. Critics will say this is the second mistake that Stephen made. In verse 6, God spake on this wise, that is after this manner to Abraham, that his seed should sojourn in a strange land, and that they should bring them into bondage and treat them ill 400 years. 400 years. However, in Galatians 3, about verse 17, he said that the law came in 430 years after the promises. Well, if it were 430 years after the promises, it couldn't be that they would be in bondage for 400 years. So how do you explain that? And I've got a lengthy note under number 4 to try to explain that. 4 passages relate to the time Israel was in Egypt. Genesis 15, 430 years. But he also says, in the 4th generation they shall come hither. Exodus 12:40 says the time the children of Israel dwelt in Egypt was 430. And then here in Acts 7, that they should bring them into bondage and treat them ill 400 years. And then Galatians 3, a covenant confirmed beforehand by God, the law which came 430 years after doth not disannul. The problem lies in explaining the difference between Galatians 3:17, which states that there were 430 years between the time God made promise to Abraham and the time the law was given in Exodus 20, and other passages which indicate Israel would be in bondage at least 400 years, specifically 430. To further complicate matters, Genesis 15 mentions that Israel's exodus would come in the 4th generation. How could only 4 generations fit 400 years? First, one explanation may use, this first explanation is actually the position I took for a while when I was a lot younger, and it uses Galatians 3:17 as like an anchor, and then everything else has to be fit around that anchor. That from the time the promises were given until the giving of the law was 430 years. And so if you put the years together, the time of the promise and covenant to Abraham to the birth of Isaac, 75 to 100, that's 25. Isaac's birth to the birth of Jacob, 60 years. Then Jacob's birth when he went into Egypt was 130. You remember that from Genesis 47. So you add those numbers together. From the original promises to Abraham in Genesis 12 to actually Jacob going into Egypt was 215 years. But then you add again to that the number of years from the time of Jacob in Egypt until the death of Joseph. Joseph was 39 years of age. Remember when he stood before Pharaoh. And a little bit after that's when his family came in. But then Joseph is 110 when he dies. Well, 110 from 39 leaves how many? 110 from 39 minus 39 leaves. Kirsten, you can do that. You can do that when you're 2 years old. How much is that? 110 minus 70, 71. Yeah, 71. So I've got it on the notes here. Number of years from the time of Jacob and each to the death of Joseph will be 71 years. We add those years together from the promises to Abraham until the end of Genesis would be 286 years. Well, if you subtract the 430 that Galatians 3:17 mentions from the promises of Abraham to the giving of the law, that only leaves 144 years from of the years in Egypt. And even only a part of that would be in bondage. And on the next page, that's what I mentioned. This would mean only 144 years would have transpired between the time from the death of Joseph to the giving of the law. Israel's actual captivity would have been much shorter than the serving of in affliction God told Abraham they would endure for 400 years, and to which Stephen here in Acts 7 refers. Another difficulty lies in accounting for how Israel could multiply as fast as necessary given those years and numbers of their descendants actually mentioned. Levi had 3 sons, Kohath, Gershon, Merari. Kohath had 4, Amram, Izhar, Hebron, and Uzziel. However, not later than a year after Israel left Egypt, the tribe of Levi numbered 22,000 males. You do the math on this, and it's just an impossibility. And so there's an explanation on under H there. What is the explanation? The Hebrew text of Exodus 12:40 says, the time of the children of Israel dwelt in Egypt was 430 years, yet the Septuagint, or the Greek version, says in the sojourn of the children of Israel while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan was 430. So it would seem that it was this passage Paul referred to in Galatians 3:17. Paul's argument was that the law came in a long time after the promises to Abraham. That's the argument he makes in Galatians. And it did not disannul the promises. The law didn't. There were 2 different things, separated by many, many years. So Paul's emphasis was not on an exact number of years, but the fact that many years had passed after the promises when the law was added. All right, that's one explanation and kind of a caveat to some of it. A second is what I believe is true. A second is that the 430 years of Exodus 12:40 actually covered the time Israel was in Egypt, and Stephen's reference to that is in round numbers, like 400 rather than 430, as is true of Genesis 15:13. Yet that demands an explanation of in the 4th generation. Under A, this would mean that a generation lasts approximately 100 years and would not mean what a generation usually means. If that's true, then it's used in a general way to refer to 100 years, and that would be, and 4 of them would coincide with 400 years earlier mentioned. Though only 4 generations are mentioned, Levi, Kohath, Amram, and Moses, it's likely to make the number fit Genesis 15:16, and that actually some generations were skipped, as is done in other genealogies. You know, if somebody could say, my great-grandfather was a second cousin to George Washington, you know, you wouldn't have, if you establish one link, then you know there's going to be some intervening links, though they're not necessarily mentioned. And I think that's the way it is. We know that in Matthew 1, in the genealogy of Jesus, you remember from Abraham to the patriarchs, Abraham to David's 14 generations, and David to the carrying away into Babylon's 14, carrying away into Babylon to Christ was 14. Y'all remember that? And he mentions that specifically in Matthew 1. Well, it's likely, those were likely memory devices. And because we know, even from the reading of Kings and Chronicles, that Ahaziah, Joash, Amaziah, and Jehoiakim are not mentioned in the genealogies of Jesus in Matthew 1. And they're skipped to keep the 3 groups of 14 generations symmetrical. It's interesting to note from 1 Chronicles 7 that there are 10 generations mentioned between Ephraim, Levi's brother, and Joshua, approximately the same time frame that occurred from Levi to Moses. Therefore, the 4th generation of Genesis 15:16 must be a figure of speech or round term for 400 years, and that a number of generations of people not significant to the Bible story are overlooked. That explanation takes into consideration that the Hebrews had no term for grandfather or great-grandfather to specify ancestors, only father. You remember, everybody in this room can quote Matthew 1:1, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of David, and then all the way back to Abraham. I thought all of us could quote it. All right, he's the son. He's a descendant of. And so the word for son did not necessarily mean one generation. It could mean 2, 3, 4. Kind of like the word cousin could just be a family member, not necessarily what we think. On a family tree, here's a mom and dad have a boy and a girl. So they're sisters. They're brothers and sisters. And then the boy here over has another boy, and then the girl has one, and so we'd say, well, they're first cousins. And then if they have children, then the relation between those in that lineage, second cousins. And then the relation here back to there might be first cousin one removed. We specify in the way of counting genealogy. They didn't. And so that likely, there were some generations likely skipped. And then at the end here on C, this explanation takes into consideration that Hebrews had no term for grandfather or great-grandfather to specify ancestors, only father, just the same way it does with son. Given that there could have been 8 or 10 generations between Levi and Moses, there were likely 2 Amrams, an earlier one who was the son of Kohath, and later one who was the father of Moses. I know it's a lot of notes, but sometimes when a person who doesn't want to believe the Bible makes a critical statement on it, he's trying to critique something and say something, well, that's just mistakes all through the Bible. You have to answer them. And there are answers. There are answers. But sometimes we have to do a little more reading. All right. The next number here. 5. What was the nation to which Stephen referred in 7:7? The nation to which they shall be in bondage will I judge? Egypt. That's right. And Stephen covers from whom to whom in the review of his history in verse 8. That's right. Abraham down to Joseph. All right? Now, in 9 through 16, I've got a couple of remarks on the chart here. The patriarchs rejected Joseph, and yet God was with him. That's an interesting idea. Yet God was with him. And that's the point that Moses makes back in Genesis 37. When the brethren sold him in, and he was there in Potiphar's house, and it says about 3 or 4 times, but God was with him. But God was with him. Here's this mistreatment by his own brothers, and yet God was with him. Here's Jesus Christ, mistreatment by his own Jewish flesh and blood, yet God was with him. Same thing, and he's going to make that tie toward the end. Let's read these. Patty, if you would, 9 through 16, please.
And the patriarchs became envious and sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him, and delivered him out of all his troubles, and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Now a famine and great trouble came over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our fathers first. And the second time, Joseph was made known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to the Pharaoh. Then Joseph sent and called his father Jacob and all his relatives to him, 75 people. So Jacob went down to Egypt, and he died, he and our fathers. And they were carried back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham bought for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem.
All right. Interesting, the specific history that's brought to light. On the next one, number 7, Stephen draws a contrast between verses 9 and 10 in activities. What's the contrast, and how does it tie the overall thrust of the speech? All right, the patriarchs did what? Sold him. They sold out. They moved with jealousy, and yet what? Did you say it, David?
God saved.
God was with him. That's right. God was with him. Stephen's speech in verses 10 through 14 describe what? Anybody? Yeah. What was that you said, Sister Janet?
The time in Egypt, about Israel's time in
Yes.
Egypt.
Yes. The migration of Jacob's family into Egypt and their development there. How many of Jacob's children originally went down into Egypt? Verse 14. 75. Note the number in Genesis 46 and Deuteronomy 10. How many are recorded there? 70. Got another note. At least two explanations can be given for this apparent discrepancy. One is that Stephen, being a Hellenist, read from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. It reads, all the souls of the house of Jacob who went with Jacob into Egypt were 75. It makes the additional 5 by giving at verse 20 the names of the 2 sons of Manasseh, 2 of Ephraim, and 1 grandson of the latter. Stephen then gave the figures as he and his hearers read them in their Bible, McGarvey mentioned. A second explanation could be that Jacob's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren amounted to 66, which is what Genesis 46 teaches. Adding Jacob himself and Joseph with his 2 sons, we have 70. If to the 66 we add the 9 wives of Jacob's sons, Judah's and Simeon's were dead, Joseph could not be said to call himself and his own wife or his 2 sons into Egypt. Jacob is specified separately by Stephen. If you put the 9 with 66, we have 75 persons. That was Henry Haley in his book, Alleged Discrepancies. So either way, they didn't. You know, it's one thing. All these modern day critics say, well, Stephen made a mistake. He made a mistake here and a mistake there. Did the very people who were listening to Stephen accuse him of making any mistake? They didn't make any mistakes. They didn't accuse him of that. In fact, if they believed that Stephen was making all kinds of factual mistakes, they would have dismissed him carte blanche and said, he's not even worthy of listening. Let him go. You know, he's not fooling anybody. We know he's not for real. But they didn't make those accusations against him. There's another thing here, number 11. Eventually, Jacob and his sons died and were buried. Where was Jacob buried? Cave of Machpelah. While the Old Testament does not give the burial place for all the sons of Jacob, where was Joseph eventually buried? In where? In Shechem, with the original land promise given. And I tell you, for time's sake, I may not read this, but sometimes people will say, well, there's a mistake here. There in verse 15, Jacob went down into Egypt. He died, himself and our fathers. Well, that's right. And they were carried over into Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham bought for a price of silver, the sons of Hamor in Shechem. Well, the cave of Machpelah was not in Shechem. And so you've got to work that out. I think if you look down on my last paragraph of that note under number 12, right before you get to note 2, a third explanation could be that Stephen compresses and combines the 2 events of Jacob's death as well as Joseph's, and without emphasis on detail. The 2 purchases of land are telescoped in much the same way as 2 separate calls of Abraham are telescoped in verse 2, and the 2 separate Pentateuchal questions in verse 7. The reference to Shechem, the sacred place of the schismatic Samaritans, would not give pleasure to a Jerusalem audience, F.F. Bruce mentioned. And so the point is, and in fact, I was even looking at the language there. If you'll notice in the, let's see, down in verse 16, they were carried over into Shechem. They, not he, but they. Jacob went down to Egypt and he died, himself and our fathers. Well, Jacob was buried in the cave of Machpelah. Remember Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah. Those are the 6 buried in the cave of Machpelah. And so when he says, and the fathers were carried unto Shechem, and laid, they, the fathers, not Jacob. So there's several ways of looking at that, but the truth of the matter is nobody there and then accused Stephen of being factually wrong on some stuff. Well, Any comment or questions? Done too much talking this morning. All right, we'll have to stop in just a second, but we got down to the rejection of Moses and the law, which really takes up the bulk of the speech. There's Abraham, and then Joseph, and then Moses, and well, it was during Moses' life the law was given, and then he fast forwards that they were even idolaters in the wilderness. The tabernacle was in the wilderness, and even the temple, God's not limited to that. And then he moves on to Christ. So we can see where this is going. Any comment or questions? Anybody? Okay, thank you for your help.